Hey, and welcome to State of the Hack. I'm Nick Carr.
And I'm Christopher Glyer.
And we're going to talk about a few interesting techniques we've been seeing in the wild today. And we have a few special guests to talk about some research they've put out, talking about those techniques. So we can actually just get started right away. Behind us, for people tuning in, we have a bunch of financial attacker activity. And we'll actually give some of those examples because those are the guys doing some of these kind of cool techniques. But out of the gate, do you want to begin talking about something you did a Twitter thread about email tracking?
Yeah, so email Trackingpixels. I did a Twitter thread about kind of some observations and research there about a topic that's actually almost everybody in sales and marketing knows about because they leverage multiple different services, and actually quite a few red teamers know about, but very few blue teamers seem to be aware of kind of what email tracking pixels are, how they can be used. And so, for short, in your mail client of choice, you can embed an image that actually pulls from, say, a remote resource over HTTP or HTTPS, pulls in that remote resource. And so because you can do that, that is used for all sorts of legitimate purposes.
Sure.
Say, LinkedIn or Twitter or
basically
some of the
it tells a third party that you read the email, and then depending on the client, it might tell some other information about the person who opened it, right?
Yep. And so how sales and...
Super common. Like,
right.
Everybody uses these. We've talked about them on a couple different episodes in APT32 using them, but Glyer did this deep dive on a bunch of other things that exposed and turned into a red teamers chiming in about how they use them. So I think they're a lot more common than people recognize.
So, how sales and marketing can use it is, you can use a service. That service then embeds a little, one by one, either, transparent or white pixel, and different mail clients handle it differently. So the default, say, Outlook client, when you open it, will not download that image by default. It'll say, for your privacy, we haven't downloaded some images. And then you can opt in to whether you want to load those. In my research, which was not super exhaustive, but I looked at the iOS mail client, Android mail client, and then if you open up Office 365 in a web browser, it actually automatically loads all of those tracking pixels.
I think in your thread you shared how you learned some of that firsthand, right? I don't know if you want to give that example because it was kind of neat, like why you first started looking at it a while ago.
Yeah, so there's different threat actors that may be interested in learning whether you're actually opening a document, and if so, which version. And so that kind of got me curious as digging, looking at an email and saying, well, in a web browser it says like to protect your privacy, but it didn't see like a URL. So I downloaded the message file and looked at it more closely and saw this like long HTTPS thing that didn't actually show as a URL. And so I'd always assumed that like opening an email, especially on my phone, it would be like safer because you're less likely to have an exploit that's going to target your phone versus your operating system. And I was totally wrong in that by opening it on a phone or something else, what you as a blue teamer or as a victim could do is you could actually divulge your source IP address. You could divulge through the user agent string what mail client you're using and the OS version that you have, and then as well as every time you open the email. And so.
And you got a series of interesting emails with no attachments, just asking a question, or it wasn't really even asking a question, just establishing a relationship that were unexpected, that we thought were suspicious.
Right. It's kind of a precursor. Right.
Thought maybe it's a precursor to something else coming. Started taking a look, and things like the Office 365 mobile client on iOS by default, having that enabled. So what that really means is, if you're at home and you have your phone connected to your home Wi-Fi, you're divulging that your egress IP address, and when you're looking at it, what kind of phone you have, and that's what you were doing at the time. And
right.
We start to figure out, these are actually pretty hard to lock down. We see all of these ways they've been used, and we've mentioned APT32 previously on the show using them. I think when Alyssa was on from our red team talking about user behavior and who's opening payloads they send from mobile devices and stuff like that. But I think you gave a couple other interesting examples there.
Yeah, and there were so for by default, a bunch of these other mail clients auto load those tracking pixels. But part of actually the thread and people jumping in the community was kind of neat to see people kind of research or bring some things that I didn't know. So you can actually disable it on iOS, you can disable it on Android, you can disable it on the Outlook for either iOS or Android client. You can disable it in your Gmail client. So almost every mail client allows you to disable it. It's just they auto-load it by default. And so then it was kind of interesting to have a bunch of red teamers who were clearly very familiar with this topic and use it quite a bit, seeing all the creative ways that they can leverage them and how they leverage them. Tim Malcolm-Better was talking about how you could use it to figure out someone's pattern of life and like when they tend to open things on, say, a phone or versus their main computer, or
profiling some of their behavior, sending them messages or replying or a thread, a conversation at different times of the day to figure out when they're there, when they're responsive. That helps.
Right.
Or for a longer campaign, because those guys at Walmart are able to invest in the longer targeting campaigns and really limit their stage zero. I think there was some talk about kind of controlling those first payloads.
And some of the cool ones were using a public actual sales tracking platform to do it, and then kind of rolling your own Trackingpixel platform, which is really just a web server that's serving up an image and then monitoring your web server logs, right? And then seeing is it different if I use a domain or an IP address, or what happens if I use different types of domains? There's all sorts of ways that you can leverage these tracking pixels without even actually setting a malicious payload, and you can kind of test the victim's defenses and see how they handle that, all before you even actually send your real one.
And it sounds silly to dissect it so much, but you see this interplay between attacker decisions and defender controls in place. So, and you really learn a lot about these things. So like Gmail, you can't really disable fetching those images, but Google goes ahead and fetches them for you. So it doesn't leak your any information about you or the client.
Just that you open it.
And you see people using APT32 uses trial versions of sales software of these legitimate services. That seems risky. At the same time, it's not exposing their infrastructure, and then some of the sales and marketing tracking software they use lets them store their payloads actually in those cloud services. So that's a common thing I think we see different attackers do, which is store it in an S3 bucket that comes with that service.
Or different mailers, lots of different attackers use a variety of mailers that are either mass mailers or marketing ones. And it puts pressure on email security vendors because there's so many legitimate ones coming through there that coming up and figuring out which ones are not. So that can also be kind of an evasion technique as well.
And everything's a signal on the back end. There's a particular Iranian group that uses a tracking pixel, and people layer these in, right? You might actually also have a payload there, like APT32 does, but then they at least know how far through the defenses their email got. And there's a particular Iranian group that has a specifically unique payload pixel with a specific file hash they keep reusing. So there's all of these interesting ways people implement it that have different ramifications. So why might people want to know if you're going to send an inert email with nothing else and just tracking behavior? Why might you want to do that prior to sending a payload?
Well, so there are certain follow-up, when you actually send a payload, certain techniques you might actually need to know to what the victim's office version is or OS version or bit level before you even send that payload, right? So you could use a tracking pixel as a starting point to say, okay, well, I know that Nick Carr uses a Windows 10 system running Office 2016. Great. Well, now I can then target my payload for that, or maybe use Mac and you typically use your web browser to access Office 365, right? But knowing those nuances can then be used in a follow-up stage. And there's also then document profilers, right? Where you
document-based profilers, yeah. So Platinum actually did this quite a while ago with this little include picture remote resource that it pulls in. Some red teams have gotten creative in using those similar techniques to both be a profiler, but they'll attempt to do the same thing over an SMB v1 connection. Yep. So they'll have responder listening, and you can start to layer these techniques. Fin7. We believe it's a way to identify whether the recipient is the kind of person who's going to open an email, see how far it got through when they put that tracker within the document. And they expose which Office version they're using. So you can get that directly from opening something in Word. You can also get that same Office version, as people pointed out on Twitter, from the Outlook client as well. Right. So you start to get that, and that's particularly interesting. While we haven't seen Fin7 do it, we wanted to talk about one of the things that you could do, why you might want to know a particular Office version. And so for that, we wanted to bring on Rick Cole, our coworker Rick Cole. So come on in. So Rick, maybe I'll wait till you sit down. Rick has put together some research, co-wrote a blog that is out now about Vba stomping, macro stomping, and some of the stuff you can do if you know what version of Office people
and
are
it's
running.
a technique that you may not have heard of or be that familiar with, so we'll make sure to kind of give you a background and overview of the general technique as well. But let's get into it. So Rick, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, Rick. I work with Carr. I don't get in front of cameras often. So Vba stomping is nothing new on the public internet. There's plenty of great available research from folks at Outflank, Walmart, P-code dump created by Vasilin Bon.
Yeah.
I cannot recall his name. It'll be in the blog.
People. I think it started really catching on. People started understanding it when Walmart presented it. The team, both the red and blue team, talking about it at DerbyCon a couple years ago. But even since then, it's something we've been tracking. It's something evasive. I'd love to talk about why that is. But the thing that was unique here is this is some of the first time we're really seeing it leveraged in some of these larger campaigns.
Sure.
So, but let's So what are the categories of macro stomping?
Sure. The basic idea is you have VBA source and P-code, pseudocode, and a third type stored within an Office document. Not all of them are necessary for the actual macro to execute appropriately. Just the P-code itself is. So the idea is you can fool analysis tools, you can fool analysts by having a mismatch between the VBA source itself and the P-code itself. Things like OLE tools have caught up and use P-code dump to compare the two and determine when there's a mismatch, and they can report that. But prior to the research from the organizations we previously named, this was not very well documented or very well known. It's basically, it sums up to file format.
Mismatch.
You're messing with the file format, basically.
So it's like an evasion against sandboxes, for instance, because you have to compile the P code for a particular version.
Correct.
Is that right?
So when Office,
in order to do something like this, you would typically need to know like something about the user that's going to do it, because you're presumably being, particularly targeted and limiting your attack surface.
Different P code versions will not execute on different versions of Office. So
it gets back to our document or email tracking pixel discussion, which is, if you wanted to increase your chances of success, you need to know what they're running in their mail client and their Office version so that you can then compile it for that specific Office version.
And actually, in the research you put out in this blog, they also used, I believe, a marketing solution to send. And
it's named in the blog. We'll leave it there just to make sure people can get the full picture on it. But the basic idea is these things don't scale super well because you have to enumerate Office versions for your targeted, for people that will be receiving and opening your lures. Otherwise, P-code doesn't detonate correctly, the macro doesn't execute, and your payload is dead in the water.
How specific is it to like minor versions? Is it like if you're using Office 2016 versus say 2012, or is it Office 2016 like subversion A, B, C?
That's a great question, and I haven't actually gotten that in depth in my research. It's actually something I should probably explore a bit more. Maybe we can do a follow-up post on that. There are tools out there that do this for you, not necessarily through Trackingpixels. I think Evil Clippy from Outflank is probably the most well-made from my experience. But they use things like remotely hosted templates to which we're doing other research into alongside that. They use that to enumerate Office version, basically, as a precursor to following up with a malicious VBA stomped.
Any way you can break the attack down into multiple stages, you can add more control over how much you expose as an attacker to defenders, right? And then further target and eliminate. So the remote template thing goes back to, 2017, I think, 2018, we started seeing some of that, and it's still really popular just as a way to break down your attack, expose Office versions, and maybe pick and choose when and where you deliver that next thing. So I understand conceptually, not as much as the Outflank and Walmart and Vis and you, some of the P code, how you're sort of compiling it for a particular version, and you still get the banner, right? So an end user is getting it, but this is more focused on evading
a banner
analysts.
saying, this has a macro, it was downloaded from the internet, do you want to open it? You still get that prompt, right?
Correct. It's more focused on invading automated analysis tools and individual analysis by a researcher. The idea being that if a sandbox is running a very specific version of Office and you don't have different versions of Office present in various sandbox guest images, your sample may not detonate in that dynamic.
And then not actually, have any malicious activity because the macro doesn't run. And
which you can compensate for with better static analysis, but it basically weakens one half of the analysis process.
Cool. Sort of like we've talked a lot about. I've talked a lot about on guardrails being a way to exercise sophistication, but they happen to also be sandbox evasions and analysis evasions.
So what was the campaign that we saw here? How was it used and leveraged, and what was the broader campaign?
Sure. So the interest to us initially was that the payload delivered was packed by a specific custom packer that we only track UNC902 as having used in the past. This made it interesting to us because it highlighted potentially a piece of shared malware with this group versus the group we previously tracked it with. A long way of saying that this cluster didn't quite match up with what we tracked UNC902 activity as, which made it more interesting to us.
We created a new cluster for it.
We did.
You worked with the Intel. Yeah, you can see behind us. I think we have UNC902 and UNC1870. Again, just some direct exposure into that process. How something comes in, it doesn't totally match up. And we have these conversations. You co-authored the blog with our Intel cybercrime team. And everybody sort of gets together and says, yeah, this isn't quite this other group yet, or we're not totally comfortable with saying it's that. And you guys in the blog, I think, were pretty authentic in describing the nature of those overlaps to UNC902, or a lot of people refer to them as TA505. Throw Cobalt and a name in there, and sure, you'll catch some financial attackers. So, yeah. I thought that was really neat to see that. Did you mention the malware name?
MindBridge, and the blog will go deep into the analysis of MindBridge thanks to some of our excellent Flare analysis.
Awesome. And we also submitted it over to the MITRE attack team, and we continue to adopt like our internal model for how we understand these behaviors. So I know you added that to that model, and we're trying to break out, like, do we have all three different techniques? And it's a real challenge for
That's actually a great subject itself, and that Vba stopping is a colloquial term publicly for things that are a bunch of methodologies that are interoperative, right? So the ability to have the P code recompiled into VBA source when a macro is open when the source doesn't match the P code is kind of at odds with the idea that you don't want the analyst to see the macro source. So another thing tools like Evil Clippy do is they will manipulate the project stream in the actual Office document itself, so that when you try to view the macro in Office will either crash or just tell you the macro doesn't exist, depending on your version, which I haven't quite figured out entirely what the difference is.
Does the macro still run at that point?
The macro still runs because all that's required is the P code. What happens is when you open the document, the P code gets recompiled into the source for you to view when you try to view it in the editor. That can happen.
So you get compromised, but to you it just looks like that your Word or whatnot crashed.
Maybe a corrupt document. Really, it depends on who.
And project stream manipulation was used in this campaign. That's in your blog as well.
Yes.
Okay. Nice. And is there a third technique that Outflank has put out? So you can read on it about in their Evil Clippy blog, right? That we have linked.
Yeah, we'll go over it in the blog.
Perfect. It's all in there. Well, thanks, Rick, for dropping in and chatting about that. Definitely take a look. We think it's obviously a trending and interesting technique because people invest so much in obfuscating macros, and the actual macros become this nightmare to start to go through for dynamic analysis. Well, this is a different method that complicates dynamic analysis. Sorry, I meant static before. It complicates dynamic analysis and then just introduces these new problems. So
actually, you actually hit the nail on the head. It actually complicates static analysis as well, because looking at the actual compiled the P code itself is much more difficult to interpret what's happening versus looking at the source.
And again, Rick mentioned a few tools, a few more are mentioned in the blog. It's awesome to see the industry provide blue teamers with additional tools. So some of the most popular tools for parsing these out now support those. And a special shout out, I think you have a screenshot or a link to Dennis O'Brien, Malageddon's P code tool. Yeah, IrisH tool that does a number of really cool document metadata things, but also isolates out that P code. And
there's not a document parser like it. It is excellent. I highly recommend giving it a shot.
It's very cool. Well, thanks, Rick, for coming on and talking a little bit more about the technique.
All right, sweet.
Thanks. And we're actually lucky enough here to have access to two special guests today. So the other thing we want to talk about, come on. Welcome.
Hey, guys.
He's in town. So,
Cheers. Hey. Yeah, definitely.
Cheers.
Caffeine
cheers.
for everyone.
And your name is on the cup if you can see it. But Matt Bromiley, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it.
So we thought we'd have Matt on. He's in from out of town. We had the opportunity to all work together back in the day on various IRs. And
we did.
We got the gang back together recently for some of the Citrix vulnerabilities.
We did, yeah. So former Mandiant consultant, now in managed defense side of things, but we had a chance as a team to all attack a recent vulnerability. You can probably see it right here over my shoulder.
Okay.
As a team, we got to go after and help deal with the Citrix vulnerability that recently propped up, and quite frankly, was a pretty big issue, I think, for a lot of companies around the globe because a lot of folks have those appliances in place.
So you want to give a little bit of background for the audience in terms of your role and what you do and what you're focused on?
Definitely. Yeah, no. So, again, former Mandiant IR consultant and took a break, came back, and I joined the Fire and Managed Defense team. So now I get a chance to work with our awesome customer base and helping protect, detect, incident response wise, help them respond to threats, deal with all the different alerts that come through, and it's our managed defense and response service. And quite frankly, it's a pretty awesome team. So props to them, and we get to have a lot of fun. We get awesome visibility.
We get to go hard at this particular one. So what was interesting here with this vulnerability, I don't know if you want to give some background on it, but it was we have a lot of customers asking about it, a lot of people impacted by it, and that's sort of the answer to why we've put out so much on this. I think 4 blogs and tool releases and stuff like that. We just constantly are getting more and more people asking questions. And I know in managed defense, in our MDR service, this is not an area we have great visibility. Most people don't have a lot of great visibility on the particular operating system, on FreeBSD. And people don't know how to do forensics. People also didn't quite understand the exploit and how it was working. So I guess would you mind just giving
definitely.
a bit of an overview of this one?
So December 17th, Citrix basically announced the CVE number got assigned, the vulnerability was discussed and blogged about and said, hey, there's a mitigation to be put in place. I will say over the course of the next few weeks after the 17th, there were some folks who were able to kind of like piece together the mitigation and reverse it, figure out what's going on. But luckily, tools were kept internally, which was kind of beneficial for, the folks out there that hadn't mitigated yet. January 10th at about exactly, 6:03 p.m. Central.
Central time. Okay.
I remember, Central time. I remember. A Project Zero India, which has nothing to do with
Google Project Zero.
Yeah, Google Project Zero, just a name, modeled after Project Zero, but released a public exploit, which then for us as defenders, I think the clock starts at that point. Because it's just a matter of time before weaponization takes place.
That sets the prioritization, because there was scanning, everybody was sort of keeping their eye on it.
Right.
And a big part of what we do, if anybody that's looking across multiple environments or has a large enterprise environment themselves, is all like prioritizing where you need to be looking. There's so much activity going on, and we had that blend between doing detection work and hunting work and just typical response. So all of a sudden this became... we started watching this and see people hit it really quick and early. It was a bad one, right? Yeah,
and there's a combination of... We saw the same thing with like Bluekeep back in May, is when something gets announced, people just start to scan, and I feel like they're just building inventory lists. Because folks like Shodan and Gray Noise and everything were just kind of talking about, we're seeing lots of upticks and this type of thing, but no one's done anything with it yet. And then, public POC goes live. The folks at TrustedSec followed up right with it, and hats off for like, here's our POC. 2 minutes later, here's the blog to forensically analyze it.
Which they were originally holding back on it. We went out of our way to give shout-outs to those guys. I think we've done that a lot on the different episodes, but just they had a bunch of content out there ready. They were using it, talking about it, released scanners, and withheld additional capabilities, and then put out like a much more robust, much more helpful tool and a forensic explanation. And they set up a honeypot and keep sharing different things they're seeing. So we have our ultimate honeypot of all of the... all in front of the client base.
Yeah, our managed defense
so we had the opportunity to see, not only what people are just doing for targets of opportunity, but where they're going specifically that's of interest.
Yeah.
And this one, caught a lot of different groups. We saw a bunch of different distinct sets of activity.
I think also, before we get into there's one other thing for defenders to be aware of for things like this. When you're assessing vulnerabilities and looking at it, it's one other thing to consider is, okay, A, where's visibility? And then B, what types of devices does this impact? Right? There's some really scary vulnerabilities out there that, if I've got admin rights on the domain controller, I could wreak havoc. This one was an external facing appliance, which a lot of times is in front of network visibility.
Yeah.
So that, I think, helped us understand and raise the risk of, like, this is something to get in front of. And luckily, we had lots of visibility. Lots of folks are kind of putting us at the perimeter in front of these devices. And we did get to see a lot of traffic.
Of incident response inbounds immediately starting that weekend. So we had the public exploit dropped on that Friday. And we were getting I know we had emails that people already suspected that's what it was on Sunday with, like,
and then we spun up a community protection event. So that's kind of how we organize and coordinate ourselves across all the various teams, so that we can make sure that we have detection coverage in place, that we can share, best practices and observations of what we're seeing in the field. Of course, the very first thing that was weaponized was coin miners, which
always
is interesting. I'm guessing it's probably just because it's the easiest, fastest thing to deploy that you can do at mass scale and monetize in some way, shape, or form. And then, coming off of those coin miners, though, is then when we saw, it took a couple of days, I think, for a couple of threat actors to then maybe look a little more into the platform. So the Citrix Net scalers underneath the covers are running different free BSD versions. So understanding, like, what you would need to do for a payload, testing that out. So we did a blog post about a particular malware family that we saw called Not Robin. It was kind of interesting to us, actually. I think Matt and I were talking about it, a couple weeks ago, where we were first looking at the malware, and I think Willie Valentin reversed the malware. Not Robin, it came in, it basically scanned every 8 times a second, looking for new XML templates that were being dropped to disk by one of the exploits, and if it wasn't a specific 32-character key, effectively, it would delete everything. And it actually uninstalled by name some of the coin miners and other stuff it knew about. And we were kind of debating initially, like, well, is this like kind of like a Batman, like
Yeah, the word vigilante was used.
where they're trying to, like, basically
Reddit loved that one.
Yeah,
Yes.
they're basically trying to patch the internet. Well,
let me just say, the blog authors come up with the titles.
Yeah, right.
If anybody from that sub is watching, it's not a corporate push.
right.
Right? We're coming up with a way to describe it. Squatters' rights, maybe, would have been used.
But
I was here second.
the key for us was leaving the 32-bit key, meaning that they could then re-access the system or re-exploit the system and drop an arbitrary payload. Kind of tipped us off. Okay, this doesn't seem like somebody who has there's some malicious intent there.
So this group was coming in and basically cutting out anyone from being able to access the same exploit. So it could appear to be a white knight dropping in that was
felt that way,
helping fix things.
But in
what
this case,
Willie on the Flare team noticed immediately was, hey, there's something else here.
Yeah.
And we when we reversed or from an investigative perspective, we've seen presumably that same threat actor access those a couple of different investigations, come back and actually check to see what access do I have, what am I running at, where am I running, like who's the victim.
So we've seen some post-compromise action from those guys poking around. I think it follows a theme that we've talked about across a few shows, which is certainly with financial attackers, it's nothing new to do, like, access as a service, to provide. I think we've talked about it primarily over the past 2 years with interactive ransomware deployment. And in some of those cases, we find that there's, like, a handoff, or people purchasing access likely to, a motet and stuff like that, like other targets of opportunity that other people come in and interactively conduct intrusions on. Again, not a new concept there. But throughout the shows, we've talked about people, like, following the money. If we're seeing an uptick in, access as a service, and this is a good way to monetize intrusions, it's interesting to think, we don't have evidence that that's the case here, but it stands to reason that a valuable business opportunity would be coming in early with all the coin miners and boxing people out, getting that exclusive right to resell that access.
Yep.
And so that kind of thing is a concern for us, because from an Intel standpoint, that's visibility we don't typically have into that handoff. And so that's what popped this stuff immediately to the top of, like, hey, this is really interesting that someone's coming in and grabbing it for themselves.
There's an odd finding which we had with this malware, which was the boxing out of the other malware, the boxing out of the coin miners and the other things, which said someone actually sat back and looked at how is this being exploited. They almost did the analysis for us, and then we're like, okay, we're going to remove all of these things because that's evidence of someone who's not me.
Yep.
And we're going to get rid of all these. And we were like, oh, cool. So this routine cleans up that separate group.
Person
and,
probably at least had a honeypot or something going.
Yeah, guessing so.
So what we did was we took, the multitude of investigations that we were conducting for managed fence customers, for our existing customer base and new ones. We were taking the kind of learnings from doing the analysis of those NetScaler devices on FreeBSD, and then we partnered with Citrix to actually then come up with a tool that you could then download and run yourself, kind of from the learnings that we had, both of things. The blacklisted content, so high fidelity indicators like IPs and file names, other ones, but then also kind of figuring out some more methodology ones around like, okay, well, the web server is running as nobody, and so if you see processes spawned by nobody, or look in the cron logs and look for things in the cron tab that would be persistence.
So we tried to break down, like, it was really driven from we have a bunch of investigations going on and consultants coming together in that like community protection thing that Glyer described. They were sharing notes and figuring out like what's the most efficient way to separate the wheat from the chaff. Like what is interesting activity. And we got onto it with our first blog that Matt and I put out on some people doing some evasion, like a little bit of encoding to evade basic static detection. And when there's an event like this, there's a lot of publicly shared rules. I think that's a very good thing. We tried to throw down on that ourselves. We tried to put stuff out. But there's a need for like defense and detection in depth here, because there's this other class that comes through, looks at those things, one would think, and then is
figures
able
out how to
get through.
Right.
And so that's the kinds of things we try to do with our scanner, right? Is like, here's evidence of other people scanning. Here's evidence of basic or known activity. Then tell people, like, here's sort of like an evasive
Which
version
category?
of it. This is pretty bad, and we don't have an answer here, and you should go look. And our goal is always to give people as much as they need to do this themselves, and then we're available to answer questions and help. We've actually had a lot of great feedback on the tool, like directly on Git, and Willie again has been crushing that out, helping people sort it out. But we have an email inbox where people have been sending in things, so. We've been actually pumped to see a lot of other IR companies using it. We're just happy that it's helping people speed up this process.
Yeah, and as a request to anyone using it too, as you come across new artifacts, I don't think we're done seeing the exploitation of this whatsoever. And I'd highly recommend as you come across new things, by all means. I mean, we did some testing based off of, let's try some encoding substitutions. Let's see if it's case sensitive, right? The really basic things that are sometimes really simple, but evade detections.
Yes.
The flip side of that is there's also techniques out there that likely someone has not thought of or tried yet. And it's just
if you offer $10 for them.
There we go. Yeah. or
tend to share some. There was actually a great
$10 challenge.
I'll share after it. Donating money to charity for it. I'll go much harder for charity.
There we go.
But someone shared in something there as we were sharing that logic, right? And it's really pretty crazy when you take a look at how this is working. It's a non-standard Apache web server that runs on these, and so it was really cool seeing people take a look at what we had, which we thought was extremely robust detection logic, and they even found ways to get around that. For example, a typical Apache web server, if it only would respond to, let's say you can send it like a head request, and it's going to return content. You could modify your HTTP method to be a custom method, like a lowercase a, for example, and an XML file, and it's actually going to issue a GET on the back end and serve that back up. So accounting for every version of obfuscation that we've seen in the wild, expanding that to a crazy regex, and then when you see all of these other ways and the way people were sharing those things and seeing what they found, it was really cool. It was neat to see that kind of stuff getting into scanners, like people, everybody hitting this as an industry, I think, together. Yep. But I will say there's certainly things that even that scanner logic probably isn't catching. So
well, and there are limitations in the scanner too, right? Partly because of the forensic artifacts, partly because if the system has been compromised, somebody could, clean up log files, or there's other things that they could do that would be difficult for us to be, perfect around in terms of, stating thumbs up or thumbs down definitively. Some of the log files may have rolled depending on how long it's been. So say your Apache access logs or your shell history of that system. And then there are other artifacts that actually lasted much longer, like I think the cron log was a great one.
The HTTP error log
The HTTP
actually was a
error log
great
actually
one
had a
too,
bunch.
because we got to
Stuck
see
around a
some
lot more.
probing and testing as
Yeah.
well as actual commands being dumped in there. We had one managed events customer actually. They sent their netscalers and the logs lasted. They were 6 hours old.
Yeah.
That was as far back as we could go, and this was the 24th of January. So the initial kind of period had already hit. But the cool thing is, it does make you kind of strap those forensic boots on
Yep.
and go back to, all right, this is a
Yep.
FreeBSD system. What else can we go and dig through? What else can we analyze?
The same group that got together built an internal tool we have as well to help on the actual investigations, to pull like a live response, and that's something we provide and work with people on if they reach out to us. So it's cool to see. I realized we only talked about like 2 of the groups. We had the Not Robin stuff. We had coin miners.
Oh, we had another round of coin miners that actually then did a brute forcing of internal Redis systems to deploy more coin miners. Like it was like the second round of it.
So I wanted to talk about
lateral movement.
Yeah, I want to talk about a particular group because everybody a year ago was super interested in Eternal Blue ransomware.
Yeah.
And that
faded away.
There were some problems in some of that. But
so the
fast forward to this, you guys actually just put out the 2 of you worked on a blog about this same exploit being used for that, like with evidence of Eternal Blue.
Yep.
Yeah.
So backstory in that, one of a really good signature, or at least indicator, it's a very like weak signal, but is looking for curl downloading a shell script. And so, these devices, one of the things from a post-compromise perspective is an attacker would commonly use curl, download a shell script, and then do something from there. So what I was doing is I was going through every payload across our network sensor fleet, looking for every unique shell script that was downloaded, and then doing further analysis. And I found this one shell script that then all it did was basically make another call out to download 2 different files. Worked with the reverser to put those together. One was XOR encoded. You put them together, it's a zip. Inside that zip then is a Python-based scanner, 2 different Windows payloads, one 32-bit, one 64-bit, and then 2 different replay traffic of Eternal Blue. And so when you actually put all of this together, you have somebody who then mass scanning the internet for compromised systems, downloading the shell script, which then download more payloads, access whatever internal systems that device can access, and then see if they're vulnerable to Eternal Blue, and then push the Windows payload. The Windows payload was really simple. It just used like cert-util to download another payload to that end system. And that end system was then, or that final payload, which took us a while to get, was a ransomware sample of a family that we actually still haven't seen before. That had the person like Thor Ragnarok, because there was all sorts of Ragnarok.
Yeah, big cinephile out there deploying ransomware.
Yeah.
Your emails are Asgard, and you deployed Ragnarok ransomware. So good on that one. There was an interesting finding here in this one. The best part about this story is about the first 2 hops of downloading that Christopher talked about. We saw everything else we had to actually reverse and figure out. Primarily, and this is where like the intricacies of Netscaler come into play here, or Gateway, I should say, come into play. That attack actually failed because Python was not installed on this particular version. So forensic analysts, if you're looking out there, this is one thing to consider, right? The attackers are only capable of the software that's on there. And it's funny, you guys were talking about fingerprinting devices earlier in this episode. Well, that would be another way to figure out what's installed, what am I capable of doing.
That's something we learned in great detail writing that scanner. Willie was putting it together to figure out like what language can we use for it, and you start to see what's on all the different versions.
Yeah.
And yes, definitely.
Yeah, it's a fun setup. And then the other side of it is we also uncovered, so that was a pretty extensive way, I think, to find internal hosts or to look for additional vulnerabilities or to really pivot from a Netscaler. There's another technique that we're seeing used, and I don't know if I'd associate this with a cluster of activity. I think it's a thing that could happen. But on these devices, depending on how they're configured, there's 2 particular configuration files, which may or may not provide some additional access into the rest of the environment. You could see LDAP creds, hash credentials for people who are utilizing like VPNs, load balancing devices, so on and so forth. And there's a couple conf files which we also flagged on in the script and given them a fair shout out to if you see those in other places.
Yeah. So what might you use some of those for? I know like Rich Warren was big early on telling people about that SMB, that conf file, what to be used for.
Yeah, so I think the main things you could use, so if there are, say, Windows creds to connect to LDAP in there, you could obviously, whatever, SMB or equivalent, DC, RPC access you have from that Netscaler device, you could try and move laterally. Another thing you could try and do is let's say someone's using Azure Active Directory or Office 365 or something like that, that account may or may not have privileges there, either to log into or at a minimum just to do profiling all the users and groups of an organization if it's a valid Azure Active Directory account, which you could then do follow-ups in terms of now you know all the emails or whatnot. Or if it is a valid account with an email, then potentially sending spear phishing or other attacks. There are session tokens stored on the device, so you could potentially get, if it's being used for VPN, that you could use to hijack a user's VPN session. And there's also potentially, if you're using the device for SSL termination, you could potentially grab some SSL private certs and then do nasty malicious things that with those private certs.
Yeah, fun stuff.
I think this has been crazy because this has been a wild year already. I think this was dropping and there was a bunch of other CVEs and Curveball and the current IE 0 day out there that's
don't forget the remote desktop gateway.
Bluegate
stuff.
yeah.
So there's follow the MSRC crew and what they're putting out, and more than ever, I mean we went so hard on this one just because we got that work. Everybody was reaching out, had questions. It was something new for them. It was something like sort of in our sweet spot. There are a lot of other concerns, a lot of other things we're responding to, and it seems like, as a wild generality, like in 2019, we didn't have as much exploit-related work, and this year already in this first month, it's been pretty crazy. So I just, as always, patch, and defenders, think about some of this. Share what you're seeing. We'll keep sharing.
Yeah, reminder, there are patches for all the Citrix NetScaler versions at this point.
Yeah, they moved the patching deadline up.
Accelerated it forward.
Yeah, so make sure that you apply those, and if you have concerns about whether your NetScaler device has been compromised, we have you can run the latest version of the script. If you need help interpreting the output, feel free to send us an email and we can help you there.
Check the many blogs if you want, or we'll help point you to various resources. And I
will say an easy search term, all of the blogs are modeled after HTTP headers. So if you're looking for the commonality there, aside from that, we got clever with the header correlation.
We thought so. People were like, hey, it comes back with a 400.
I got 404. That means it doesn't,
They thought that the page didn't load, so we're working on it. And we're going to keep putting out info. Like we said, to recap, check this stuff out. The Ragnarok thing is fun. Actually, in Rick's blog, there's the attacker's love of Onyx, so maybe we can get that pumping over the background right now. No, I don't think we have the licensing for it. But check that blog out and hit us up if you see any of this, and definitely if you see interesting attacker tracking and Trackingpixels, stuff like that. We love it. So thanks so much.
Sweet. Thanks for joining us.
Everyone. Cheers.